Has the internet collapsed time? Why does it seem like culture has slowed or even stopped progressing altogether compared to the past? Why does it seem like decades used to be clearly defined by distinct trends, but now seem to be stuck in a loop, like a cosmic glitch where suddenly nothing is new anymore and just a constant rehash of the past? At times, it can feel that throwback culture is becoming so accurate, so all-pervasive, so simulated that it's disorienting. It can lead you to feel like you genuinely don't even know what year it is anymore. It's not that people shouldn't be allowed to dress how they want, reference the past, or even that they aren't doing it well. It's just that it feels too performative, too detached from their authentic origins, too obviously born from fast fashion and algorithms. Like everything has become so thought out, so perfectly curated, so contextualized that it feels uncanny. Like culture has now become based solely on simulating something else. Not because it's authentically enjoyed, but because identity has now become an artificial performance. You don't wear that band tee because you like that band, dress like a blue-collar farmer because you actually are one, or wear that American flag because you're so patriotic. You wear it because of the aesthetic it represents. Culture is no longer expressive of authentic identity or experience, but symbolic of some abstract internet aesthetic or subculture. Identity has now become a disposable product. It feels like we have entered an era with such a hyper-awareness of the world, ourselves, and our identities that reality itself has now become one big, over-contextualized performance. But what if I told you where we are today isn't actually some random fluke, but the understandable conclusion to where we've always been headed? The 20th century was a period of rapid social deconstruction and technological progress. And that progress could only go on for so long before the changes that defined it transitioned from novel to the new normal, the new cultural baseline. In some ways, we're just at the end of one cultural S-curve, about to enter our own, with many fundamentally civilization-altering technologies also predicted to radically reshape our society and culture as well. In this video, I want to dive deep into modern-day culture and why it can feel so simulated and rehashed. We're going to touch on a lot, from postmodernism in the age of simulated identity, to previous decade trends, consumerism, and why it feels like the 21st century doesn't have a distinct culture. We're going to touch on how the death of the monoculture, rise of hyperindividualism, and social media have made culture so niche, so fragmented and reproducible that the centralization of the past is impossible now. We will also touch on neoliberal capitalism and how it incentivizes profit reliability over creative risk, and how corporations are attempting to capitalize on nostalgia, which helps create a culture of endless remakes and constant rehashing. We will then end by challenging these common critiques made against our current era, and how this new, highly democratized, everything, everywhere, all at once period of culture can also be viewed as a departure from the disposable culture of the past, with our current era looking almost like an appreciation for what we already have. In other words, why do we need to dispose of everything current in favor of something novel? Are decade trends in linear cultural progression even natural, or just the result of 20th century capitalism and social rebellion? In this video, we're going to touch on it all.
Mass consumption makes you the most powerful giant in the land.
The next 10 years will bring more change than the previous 100 years.
Why have people looked the same for the last 20 years?
This is the B-52s, an iconic rock band that formed in Athens, Georgia. They are known for their camp performances, experimental sound, and unapologetic queerness. This song is Give Me Back My Man and features Cindy Wilson as the lead vocalist. It's one of my favorite B-52s songs, with this live performance from the Dutch TV show Top Pop being something I always come back to. Now, based solely on this performance, what year would you say it happened? The 1960s, maybe late 60s, possibly early 70s? I mean, it's obviously older just by the sound, but there's no fooling us with a retro look like that, right? Well, this performance was actually from the year 1980. You know, the one with chart toppers like Queen's Another One Bites the Dust and Call Me by Blondie. the year where disco fashion still lingered, shoulder pads were gaining traction, hair was getting bigger, and the blowouts that would come to define the 80s were just on the horizon. Little did anyone know that the B-52s were not only ahead of their time in sonic experimentation, but also in style. This cosplay-like aesthetic choice, based heavily on the past, should look pretty familiar to any of you watching because it is what has become the mainstream norm today. When looking at popular culture in 2025, we find that throwback culture, or heavily borrowing inspiration from the past, has become the new normal. Take a look at someone like Sabrina Carpenter. She's known for her retro 60s, 70s inspired look and sound. Sparkly go-go boots, disco-esque sounding tracks, blowouts and curtain bangs. How about Benson Boone? His new album, Young American Heart, is bombastic, theatrical, drawing clear inspiration from the pop rock of the late 70s and 80s as well. His sparkly jumpsuits and showman-like performances have even been compared to past glam rockers like Freddie Mercury, with others saying he's obviously just Harry Styles 2.0. We also have Addison Rae and Tate McRae, who are often called Gen Z's Britney Spears, with their 2000s inspired aesthetics, recession pop sounds, and intricate choreographies. Another interesting artist is Chapell Roan. Although she is often compared to Lady Gaga, I think a more apt connection would be with Cyndi Lauper and just 80s music in general. Chapell has a campy, playful tone in her work, and the retro synths, new wave inspired production, and glam pop like electronics make some of her songs sound right out of the 80s. I mean, tell me the beginning of Hot to Go doesn't sound like it's literally from 1988. What we find with artists who reference the past is that when they are new, or we're experiencing them in the present, all we can seem to do is compare them to their past inspirations. But as time inevitably goes on and new trends and eras begin, we end up looking back, now associating that time with the looks they had, even though they were originally referencing something earlier.
She wore blue velvet.
Lana Del Rey, Adele, and Amy Winehouse were some of the main artists leading the revival of vintage aesthetic trends in the late 2000s and 2010s. 60s glam, winged eyeliner, high-waisted everything, mini beehives in the form of bumpets were everywhere. Lana Del Rey was known for her Jackie Kennedy, Priscilla Presley-like aesthetic. She often wore her hair in a 60s-inspired beehive and wore mid-century inspired fashion. Adele also had a more mid-century modern aesthetic and was never seen without her winged eyeliner. Amy Winehouse not only looked like she was from the 60s, but sounded the part too. The thing is that while these trends may have originally been inspired by the 50s and 60s, when we look back from where we are in the present, those throwbacks are now associated with the 2010s, sometimes even more than their authentic origins. When I look back to the 2010s and remember these specific aspects, I noticed just how much it did kind of look and sound like the 60s or 70s.
My name is Lady Gaga.
Look at Lady Gaga in her debut. Disco pop, synth, heavy auto-tune, big shield sunglasses, shoulder pads, and Grace Jones inspired scarves. Look at Kesha and LMFAO. Neon, cheetah print, and maximalism were in. These are all heavily inspired by the 1980s, but have now come to be known as indicative of recession pop, or the music popular during the 2010s following the Great Recession. When I look back on this form of fashion and sound, I realize that the 2010s were literally our 80s. Look at the explosion of indie music and grunge aesthetics also happening in the 2010s. Minimalism and black and gray were in. Everyone owned a Nirvana shirt even though they never listened to a single song. Teenage angst was huge, and the sad girl, sad boy archetype dominated Tumblr and SoundCloud. Everyone obsessed over the 90s, in the same way everyone obsesses over the 2000s today. The 2010s were basically a clash of 90s grunge minimalism and 80s neon maximalism. Coming back to Sabrina Carpenter though, some can't even agree on which era she's referencing. Some say it's obviously the 60s and 70s, others say she's more hyper-feminine girl pop of the 2000s. The truth is though, she can actually be both at the same time because we live in a world where for the past 25 to 30 years, everything that has come to be a defining trend of a decade, whether it be the 2020s, the 10s, the aughts, or the 90s, have been heavily inspired by nostalgia and previous decades.
The reason that bad things happen to you is because you're a dumb.
Think of the 90s and the popularity of That 70s Show, the Austin Powers movies, platform shoes, and the mesh between futurism, 70s low-rise, and 60s boho chic of the 2000s. The 2010s ushered in that era of 80s maximalism, synth, and neon, clashing with 90s grunge, retro throwbacks, and alternative sounds. The 2020s so far seem to be a clash between referencing the actual aesthetics of the 70s and the simulated throwback version from the early 2000s, and I think the 2030s will be a throwback of the 2010s, with the 2010s again just being a throwback of the 90s and 80s. It's repetitive, I know, but what I am basically saying is that we are living in a cultural photocopier. A world where culture becomes a copy of a copy of a copy, where with each new iteration, something is tweaked or added and then reproduced in another future decade, with the past references used becoming associated with the present decade that referenced it instead of their authentic original inspirations. So guess what? That uncle was right. The 80s were the last decade of real culture. The 80s marked the last time culture progressed by rejecting what came before without highly referencing the past for their aesthetics. The 1990s, specifically the mid to late 90s, marked a turning point in the development of digital technology and therefore culture. In a Pitchfork interview way back in 2011, Mark Richardson sat down with Simon Reynolds, author of Retromania, a book that touches on the 21st century's growing fixation with past trends and culture. Reynolds helps break down what began to change in the 90s and 2000s, saying, "As each decade unfolds, there's a bit more of an archive, and that archive becomes more accessible too. For me, the real turning point is when broadband internet really took off at the end of the 90s, YouTube as well. That's a real threshold. A lot of the stuff that fans used to trade, like degraded copies of videos and clips of people on TV shows in the 60s and 70s, is all going up and becoming common property, and it happened really quickly. I don't know if you've had this experience, but when I speak to young music fiends, whether they're in bands or bloggers, they seem to know so much more music than I did when I was their age. So then wait, does that mean nostalgia was invented in the late 90s and ever since has become mainstream? Well, not exactly. It is obviously important to point out that nostalgia is inherently human and that what we are seeing today isn't necessarily 100% new. In fact, we can actually see these same nostalgic throwbacks every 20 years or so.
I got chills, they're multiplying.
In the 70s, we saw the popularity of the Grease movies, which heavily romanticized the 50s. In the 80s, we saw 60s-inspired music and movies make a comeback. Why every 20 years? Well, it ties into what I spoke about in a past video, where I laid out that nostalgic trends in human society are more reflective of how the mind works, and not so much about the inherent greatness of the periods themselves. When we are young, our brains haven't fully developed, there are far more neural connections, we have less responsibility, we are far more mindful and therefore happier, and we tend to immortalize our childhoods as comforting in almost a utopian way. Like no matter how bad the world objectively was when we were kids, we still look back and perceive it as infinitely better in literally every way than the present. Every 20 years or so, you just so happen to have a majority of the population reach adult age, with the harsh reality of adulthood often making them nostalgic, which is then reflected in popular culture. In the 70s, those who were in their 20s and 30s grew up in the 40s and 50s. In the 80s, they grew up in the 50s and 60s. In the 90s, it was the 60s and 70s, and so on and so forth. Okay, so then what makes today any different from the throwbacks of the past? Well, while nostalgia and throwbacks always existed, they didn't dominate and largely dictate cultural evolution in the way they do now. This is something we will discuss more later on, but the monoculture was so centralized and cultural evolution so gatekept that only certain people, like celebrities, were able to push and develop culture in very specific, forward-looking ways. What happened in the 90s was new technologies increasing the reproduction of past media, as well as the beginning of the mass democratization of society we see today, which led to a more abstract, decentralized cultural development. In other words, what really changed in the 90s was the introduction of new technologies like VHS, camcorders, and the internet. These all marked the first real massive acceleration of media access, consumption, and reproduction since the invention of the television. The past became widely available in new ways, and what we started to see for the first time was simulating what came before as an aesthetic choice. Media became highly referential, skepticism and even cynicism became mainstream, and mass consumption replaced meaning. What I am describing is postmodernism. Ever since I first studied postmodernism, I immediately became fascinated by how it explains so much of our society today, and I'm honestly shocked that more people don't talk about it, especially when attempting to understand anything about the modern world. Postmodernism can help us understand things from politics and distrusting mainstream narratives, or even our current post-truth world.
You're saying it's a falsehood, and they're giving Sean Spicer, our press secretary, gave
alternative facts.
It can help us grasp contemporary culture, thought, art, technology, and the increasingly simulated throwback culture we have now. But I will also be the first to tell you that, as with any philosophical movement, postmodernism is very nuanced, and there are many thinkers and reactionaries and books and papers written on it. And I hope one day I will have the time to do an in-depth deep dive video, but that would also probably be like a 3-hour long video. So this is all to say, I'm going to summarize and condense a bit to make it as digestible as possible. So just keep that in mind, because I want everyone to be able to understand this all. Now, I know when a lot of people hear the word philosophy, they may immediately imagine a bunch of ancient stone busts or old men who ponder everything. And you might think to yourself, who the fuck wants to just sit around all day and think, what does any of this have to do with me or my life? But what you may not know is that philosophy affects all of us, and it directly, or more often indirectly, informs and explains how you think and experience the world, even if you may not be aware of it. This is because philosophy both explains and molds society, which then trickles down and influences you, the individual. You may view the world as spiritual, emotional, inherently beautiful, and full of personal meaning. Sounds like romanticism. You might strongly believe in human rights, the equality of all people, and scientific progress, which you can thank the Enlightenment for. You might follow a religion that was inspired by earlier philosophers and their teachings, like Plato and Neoplatonism. You might take immense pride in your nation, heritage, and the people who make it up, with the nation-state being a concept that couldn't exist without the contributions of earlier philosophers like Hegel or Rousseau. You might distrust anything mainstream, be highly skeptical of any objective truth, or love to reference the past, which again is just postmodernism. Philosophy is simply the study of fundamental reality, meaning knowledge, values, reason, the mind, and language. It is a way to examine and critically analyze all aspects of human life, experience, history, and society. So if you ever have questions or thoughts about why society or culture is the way it is from a big picture type perspective, philosophy can help you accurately answer them. So to understand where we are today and what postmodernism really is, we need to quickly give some context. So to begin, imagine history as 3 main periods. There is the pre-modern, modern, and postmodern. The Premodern Era is typically considered to include all of human history before the modern period, from the beginning of civilization through the ancient world, Middle Ages, and up to the Enlightenment. While this term doesn't have a fixed starting point, I'm using it here in a simplified way to describe an expansive era in which spiritual or religious worldview shaped society, knowledge, and truth. Again, I know this all might seem abstract or off topic, but just stay with me here because it's all going to make sense, and you need this context to understand what I'm about to talk about.
Who are you? I am that I am.
For most human civilizations around this time, knowledge, truth, and progress all came from some form of deity and through the development of spiritual institutions or rituals. In Europe specifically, humans were seen as infinitely inferior to the divine, and God was seen as all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good, meaning if humans wanted to advance, they needed to be more like God or please Him so they could get some of that knowledge. In other words, the only way to get this divine knowledge was through divine appeasement in the form of revelation. Truth today comes from science, and scientific knowledge helps develop new technologies which advance culture and society, but in the pre-modern era, truth could only be found in scripture, prayer, or the religious leaders of the church. Humans were inferior, we couldn't possibly advance or figure it out on our own, and so we didn't need human logic, reason or experimentation, we needed God and the wisdom of the church. Therefore, technological advancement was much slower, less efficient, and knowledge and cultural development were far more stable compared to the rapid changes of today. Societies were more homogeneous and centered around a grand religious narrative that dictated and explained all aspects of life. There was no individual in the way we view it today. The idea of human potential alone didn't yet exist, and progress only came from the divine through intervention. Now, it's important to note that these movements and linear way of thinking are born from Western Abrahamic thought. Countless indigenous and Far Eastern peoples had their own diverse ways of thinking and viewing progress in society. For instance, because the Judeo-Christian Bible tells a linear story with either Jews waiting for their Messiah and Messianic age, or Christians getting their Messiah and then waiting for the second coming in New Jerusalem, this inspired Western society to view history and progress as linear. Those in the Far East and in indigenous lands around the world, not always, but most often, subscribe to a more cyclical view of history and progress due to their philosophies and religions, which were inspired by the cycles found in nature. This obviously also isn't to say that after the modern era began, everybody on Earth magically stopped being religious or adopted Enlightenment era values, just that before the modern era, these values didn't influence societal or global culture basically at all. Today, there can be countries, cultures, or even just individuals that follow aspects of every era all at once. So when we say the pre-modern, modern, or postmodern era begins or ends, we aren't being literally absolute, just describing which philosophy becomes the overwhelming dominant one at a specific time. It's just important not to use these Western terms as rigid and absolute because they are born from Western perspectives. However, I do think some specific aspects of the European pre-modern concept are kinda universal in a simplified, descriptive way. So what I mean by this is that before the modern era began, nearly all human societies revolved around some sort of hierarchical, religious-based meta-narrative that dominated their culture and society. The individual didn't exist as it does today. Human potential was tied to divine intervention in spiritual institutions, and the development of culture and technology was far slower, nearly imperceptible to a single human in their lifetime. The modern era is typically believed to begin around the Age of Enlightenment, starting around the late 17th century and ending around the mid-20th century. However, some extended as far back as the Renaissance, which marked the first real development of many future influential ideas like humanism, scientific advancement, philosophy, and individualism. The Enlightenment, sometimes called the Age of Reason, represented a fundamental shift in how humans had experienced the world since our inception. Suddenly, the source of knowledge and progress shifted from God to the individual. Almost all at once, an explosion of new ideas took hold: individualism, inherent progress, belief in human potential like scientific or technological advancement, an emphasis on reason, logic, skepticism, and a sudden reimagining of God's place in human affairs, and sometimes a rejection of its need altogether. The Enlightenment represented a sudden shift away from superstition and magical ways of thinking to focusing on the material and what we can immediately observe and learn about the world. This new way of thinking sparked countless movements, from the scientific and industrial revolutions to the creation of liberal democracy, capitalism, and Marxism. The Age of Enlightenment also ironically coincided with the barbaric age of colonialism, which, like I mentioned earlier, led to these ideas spreading globally, but usually by force and justified by a Eurocentric belief in cultural superiority.
Stocks reached record peaks, and Wall Street boomed in a steady golden roar.
The modern era was massively defined not just by new ideas, but also economic explosion. The Industrial Revolution began to rapidly reshape human civilization in radical ways. Breakthrough after breakthrough meant new advances in medicine, agriculture, and people began living longer and healthier. The population boomed, and new job opportunities led to the development of modern cities, concentrating even more talent and ideas, which helped further human development, creating a feedback loop. New technologies created entire new industries and ways of life, and suddenly, culture was being produced, reproduced and spread at incredible rates. Books were now able to be made cheaper and quicker, and with rising literacy rates, more people were able to read them.
The Niagara Power Station will be capable of generating enough electricity to light the entire Northeast.
Electricity turned night into day, railroads stitched together continents, and steamships accelerated the spreads of goods, ideas, and peoples. The invention of the telegraph, radio, and motion film camera suddenly created new ways to experience, spread, and create culture as well. Under this new economic system, capitalism, the way we lived our lives, viewed our world, and experienced culture began to change. Culture began to shift from tradition to commodity. Culture was no longer rooted only in traditions that transcend and predate the individual, but could now be centered around and directly inspired by the individual in the present. When we think of the word culture today, we tend to think of the past in the form of some tradition. Culture is old, ritualistic, and about continuing something that started long before you, the individual, was alive. But under capitalism, and with all these new technologies, culture became more reproducible and personal, and with the development of the middle class, more people could take part in its new, rapid development. Now, cultural evolution was no longer limited to the elites or aristocracy, but became democratized and viewed as something that needed consistent innovation. Capitalism gradually transformed culture from something that was mindfully experienced into something that rapidly progressed, with each new stage quickly being disposed of in favor of novelty. It completely reworked how humans experience the world and made us view change as necessary and inevitable. The modern era can be defined by a newfound optimism in human potential, experience, and the development of society due to all these ideas and technologies creating such rapid change. Did I lose you?
Are you still with me?
Good, because this is where part of the answer to the question, why don't decades have distinct trends like the 20th century anymore, can be found. One of the simplest reasons why our current decades don't appear to have as many decade-defining trends as the 20th century has to do with time, technology, and social change. Firstly, we exist in the present, looking towards the past while attempting to use it to dictate the future. In other words, we are observing the decades of the 20th century as the rule and not the exception. As we should all understand by now, the 19th and 20th centuries saw genuinely breathtaking amounts of change. And while that change was rapid relative to all of human history, it also didn't happen literally overnight. What we see in the decades of the 20th century was a gradual but noticeable progression of culture, social norms, and availability of technologies, which made each new generation look pretty different from the previous. Even though social progress is not linear by any means, I do still think that for a brief moment in the first 7 or 8 decades of the 20th century, at least in America, it kinda was. During most of the 20th century, trends were in response to greater social freedoms and technological change, like the flapper movement in response to the conservatism of the Edwardian era, or the 60s counterculture in response to the oppressive conformity of the 50s. I see the 20th century as more of a developmental era for culture, a transition from one stage to the other. Before, women and minorities had no rights, people were largely socially restricted in how they could dress or express themselves, and technology was relatively limited. Over 80 to 90 years, what you saw was a progression of individual, expressive, and social freedoms until basically almost anything was allowed. In the 20s, bobs and dropped waistlines were in, but blowouts and beehives were not. In the 50s, pencil skirts and sheath dresses were in, but booty shorts and shaved heads were not. Today, pencil skirts, blowouts, shaved heads, and booty shorts can all be in at the same time, and no one bats an eye. What I am trying to describe is that we progressed and progressed and progressed, building upon what came before until we hit something like an inflection point, where now everything and anything could go, and the way culture evolved previously, like in response to past social restrictions, disappeared because now there are nearly no more social restrictions left.
Press, press,
A good example I like to use for this is Cardi B's Press music video. What we saw for most of the 20th century until like the 2010s was a progressive liberalization of female fashion, with each new trend pushing the boundaries on what could be allowed in response to past restriction. I think this music video is a perfect example of nothing being left to deconstruct or rebel against. How do you progress further beyond full nudity? This is my point. The entire 20th century can roughly be seen as a progressive liberalization of social norms and personal expression in response to new ideas and technology. When everything's been done and there's nothing left to rebel against because anything is basically allowed, culture will appear to stagnate. Communication technologies also led to great change and disruption, and one in particular has disrupted things in such foundational ways that we haven't seen in hundreds of years.
Imagine a world where every word ever written, every picture ever painted, and every film ever shot could be viewed instantly in your home via an information superhighway. And in fact, that's already happening on something called the internet.
By the time the internet gained popularity, information and culture were already being reproduced at incredible rates, but social media really blew everything out of the water. It gave us, in real time, immediate access to culture and everything that came before us down to the second it was created. This finally brings us to today in the postmodern era. If the premodern era was the one of religious grand narratives, and the modern era was inevitable progress in human potential as the grand narrative, then the postmodern era is where everything sort of collapses. The postmodern era is believed to have begun around the mid to late 20th century and is the era we are currently in, even though some argue that we are now in the metamodern era. Like we are going to see here, postmodernism is rooted in deconstruction, irony, and nihilism, while metamodernism is the concept of merging postmodern ironic deconstruction with sincerity and meaning. Think of the movie Death of a Unicorn, and how it heavily oscillates between irony, nihilism, absurdism, and the spiritual sincerity and deeper meaning in the form of an afterlife for God when they touch the unicorn's horn.
Are you okay?
I love this movie simply for this scene because it's what I imagine dying would be like, but anyways. Postmodernism was in response to modernism, and where modernism had great faith in human potential, inevitable progress, and reason, postmodernism basically rejected all of that. Postmodernism is defined by a rejection of grand narratives, skepticism of everything, especially the existence of objective truth, and focuses more on subjectivity and relativism due to the contradictory nature of human experience and history. So in other words, it's a recognition of the fact that what is true for some may not be true for others, or that our ideas as humans are heavily affected by our own personal biases, cultures, experiences, etc. Modernism believed in objective truths and grand narratives, which also helped justify colonialism, slavery, and the unregulated development of dangerous technologies. So a modernist from 1911 might tell you that culture is objective, Europeans are obviously superior, and Judeo-Christian values are better. They would tell you that technological advancement is unstoppable and the bettering of human society is inevitable. History is linear, and with each new year, everything will get better until we eventually reach the endpoint of utopia. The postmodernists would say, well, based on the human rights values of the Enlightenment, all people matter, and no culture is inherently better than another. They would argue colonialism and slavery were some of the biggest crimes in human history, and they would point to the horrors of the world wars, the eugenics movements, and government corruption as evidence that progress is not inevitable, technology can be used to worsen human life, and that the modernist worldview is too rigid and simplistic. Postmodernism basically tries to add nuance to reality, but there is so much nuance that eventually what is truth itself, what we should even believe, collapses because postmodernism favors so much skepticism and deconstruction that eventually nothing is left except blurry, contradictory versions of truth. What the modernists did was deconstruct the pre-modern importance of God, replacing it with the importance of humanity. What the postmodernists did was deconstruct the modern, inevitable progress of humanity in favor of nothing. The singular individual. You figure it out. Find your own meaning in life, which in the absence of a grand narrative often leads to nihilism. It was a recognition of the complicated nature of the world and of the unfair realities that were previously ignored, which leads to a more nihilistic, cynical worldview. Besides the shock of the world wars, American civil rights movements, and uncovering of government corruption, what also fed into postmodern distrust and nihilism was those information technologies we talked about before. First, there was the television, then VHS and CDs. These were huge steps up in expanding the amount of information a single person could consume and were efficient at spreading controversy, conflict, and paradoxical narratives at high speeds. Then there was the internet, quickly followed by social media, which blew the television out of the water. Now we could all be aware of anything at any time, and because of the human negativity bias and the advertisement-driven profit model, the more controversial or conflicting something was, the more likely it was to be focused on and therefore spread. This furthered a postmodern skepticism of everything, and the massive amount of media people now consume leads many to feel defeated. There is no objective newspaper, news station, TV show, or institution anymore. There is just an overwhelming stream of information, all trying to grab your attention, all showing you different ways to live and think. This leads to what many postmodernists call a collapse of meaning, where many lose faith not just in their government or society or religion, but in truth itself. How do you know what to believe when everyone and everything is pulling you in a million different directions, telling you a million different things? In the pre-modern era, you had the church for answers. In the modern era, you had civil and government institutions. Now you have nothing except your own judgment. I see postmodernism as like the reality of the industrial world finally setting in. It's like the childlike naivete and optimism of the modern era have died down, and like the stark reality of adulthood, we now see the world in all its paradoxes in a more realistic, clear-eyed way. Now, I know you are all probably thinking,
what the f***
does any of this have to do with modern music or the throwback era we are currently in? Well, this rapid reproduction of culture not only made truth harder to decipher, but also gave us an unlimited amount of inspiration to draw from that didn't exist before. It's the idea that we spend so much time consuming so much media from so many different time periods that we inevitably begin to draw inspiration from that unlimited cultural reservoir. It's the concept that the internet has collapsed time because everything and anything exists all at once, all the time. There is no more of that previous cultural restriction that forced evolution through creativity and rebellion. There is no singular figures we can all look up to and recognize for cultural guidance and trend setting. Everyone does their own thing in their own world, largely unaware of what the other is doing. Previous generations simply didn't have as much access to the past as we do now, and culture was a lot more gatekept and centralized, which brings us again to the death of the monoculture.
3,000 screaming teenagers are at New York's Kennedy Airport to greet, you guessed it, the Beatles.
Like I explained in my previous video, the monoculture is the concept of a singular, coherent culture that we all take part in and are aware of. In the 80s, you may not have liked Prince, MJ, or Madonna, but you sure as hell knew who they were, whatever scandals they were in, and which one of their songs was currently playing on the radio. While the technologies of the 20th century were disruptive, they also weren't too disruptive and were able to be regulated and centralized, like the radio, music labels, and television. This meant we all got introduced to culture in the same way, which created more of a cohesive monoculture. This centralization of power and technology is another huge reason why the decades of the 20th century were so distinct. Social media forces us all into algorithmic niches where we are shown exactly what we like and only that, which creates the conditions we see now. With social media, someone can know everything and anything about a certain trending topic or artist only to talk to a classmate who has no idea what they're talking about. It's what happens when you make a niche meme joke to a friend and they have no idea what you're referencing, only for them to have their own niche meme jokes too that you don't understand either. It's not that social media has completely destroyed any form of shared culture at all, just that it continues the social fragmentation of society and makes reality a lot more personalized.
Pretty little baby.
Because we have immediate access to past songs and movies and fashion, we also begin experiencing them in the same personal, intimate ways that older people who actually lived through those time periods also experience them. You can see one music video from the 80s on TikTok, only to then have your algorithm show you more 80s stuff, and eventually you're seeing creators who love the 80s so much they dress like them, show you how to as well, and eventually you can feel like you're in a time machine. Social media is great at optimizing experience and connecting like-minded individuals or things with one another. It gives greater visibility to niche and alternative trends or music instead of forcing us all to only experience the monoculture. It's not that alternative people who hated the monoculture and really raged against the machine or actually enjoyed the past didn't exist before social media. It's just that they didn't have the visibility they have today, and so they didn't have as much influence. With a homogenized popular culture, only those who are massively influential, like a handful of celebrities, are the ones who largely drive trends and innovate culture. Now we can all do it with infinite access to past trends, which leads to a mixing and mashing of everything and nothing. Like I touched on in the opening, when there is so much easy access to the past, people will inevitably appreciate aspects of that past, which will then be borrowed again in the future. This then leads to the strange photocopy-like situation we are in now, where everything becomes an uncanny reproduction of something previous. The philosopher Jean Baudrillard has touched on this rapid copy and paste reproduction of culture in his work titled Simulacra and Simulation. Briefly and roughly simplified, he basically lays out that humans use symbols, images, or representations of something that exists objectively in the real world, but that over time, these representations become reproduced over and over, perverting their original meaning until they become detached from reality altogether, which makes our reality resemble a simulation, or as he puts it, hyperreality. A really simple, easy way to understand this would be using the European castle as an example. First, we have an actual medieval European castle. It represents itself and isn't referencing anything other than its real-life purpose. It is a basic representation of reality. Then we have the Neuschwanstein castle, a German castle built in the 19th century. To us in the present, it may look like any old castle, but it is actually a 19th century creation based on a romantic, idealized, almost fairy tale-like version. The original European castle it is inspired by got its distinct look from form and function, which was to protect and guard, while this recreation gets its look from pure aesthetics, which are rooted in fantasy, but that still attempts to pass as representing something real. The third example would be the castle we all know from Walt Disney. It pretends to represent something real, like the romanticized, recreated castles from the 19th century, but is even further detached from function and reality. We now enter full-on simulation with something like the animated castle from the beginning of Disney films. Now we enter a reproduction that is so far removed from its original that not only is its purpose or aesthetics detached from it, but also from physical reality altogether. It is purely digital, its own simulation, completely detached from the original, but what we now associate with actual castles in real life. So in other words, if you were to ask someone to draw what a castle looks like today, they would probably draw something that looks more like the false Disney one than a real historical castle, because symbols and media are reproduced so often, with each one being further detached from its reality, and with the simulations they create eventually replacing our reality itself. Another example we can use to better help reflect the point of modern throwback culture would go like this. First, we have something that is reflective of basic reality. In our case, think of this like an image of people in the 70s. It is objective, not abstract or a reference to something previous. It is simply itself in its most pure form. The second stage is an image from That 70s Show. It is a recreation based on the actual 70s, so it perverts and masks the reality of it through simulation, but is still slightly reflective of it. That 70s Show is obviously a show, but during the 90s, we did see certain trends and subcultures from the 70s be brought back, so just keep that in mind. The third stage would be the trends of the 2010s, which were heavily inspired by the 90s. Here, we enter a place where what we now see is a simulation of a previous simulation, so the symbols and culture we use now become a way to completely mask the basic reality they were originally from. It is a simulation of a simulation. a reference of a reference. The fourth and final stage is when we enter a world where culture now bears no relation to any reality whatsoever. In this case, this would be my theory about the 2030s and how I think they will be a revival of 2010s aesthetics, particularly the muted colors and grunge of the Tumblr era. This is when we enter so many copies of copies that we then move beyond the original and it becomes its own thing altogether, something detached from its objective, real-life reference, but that becomes our reality in the moment. Another example of this would be someone like Lana Del Rey.
I've been making videos since I was 17. I was originally just collecting vintage footage from different archives and setting moving pictures to classical music clips that meant a lot to me.
She heavily references the original, being retro Americana in the 60s and 70s, but now we have artists today who reference Lana's references, becoming a simulation of a simulation, and so on and so forth until we enter a world where you need so much context to understand the original meaning that we just give up and end up associating the copy with the original, even though they're completely detached. It's not retro Americana anymore, it's Lanacore. Simulacra, simulacrum, and hyperreality is simply the idea that symbols, signs, and culture are being reproduced so rapidly that they are getting to a point where they are detached from their original reality altogether, which can make us feel like we live in a world of constant performance and artificiality. It's the Disney Worldification of experience, where everywhere we go, everything is some strange, uncanny simulation, and it perfectly explains the culture we have today. It's why music and the constant throwbacks of throwbacks can feel so weird, because we are aware that not only are they performative, but a performance of a previous performance. It feels so confusing and tiring because it's like now we need so much explanation and context to really understand an artist or the aesthetic they are trying to represent because of just how much they reference. The last piece of this puzzle that we need to really understand why modern culture is the way it is our current economic system. Now, I talked about this in much more depth in my previous video on inauthenticity in modern music, but for the sake of time right now, I'm going to again briefly summarize. So we are nearly 50 years into an economic system known as neoliberal economics. It became widely implemented in the 80s and 90s, and to put it simply, it believes that government should get out of the market and just let it do its thing. It's an economic policy that favors low taxes, less regulation, and it is called neoliberalism because it is referencing the laissez-faire-like policies of the 19th century before the Progressive Era, the time when government was largely limited, markets were freer, and there wasn't a social safety net like today. What's most relevant to what we are talking about right now has to do with hyperindividualism and the shift to shareholder-driven profit models. Hyperindividualism is the idea that we are all responsible for our own circumstances no matter what. It's the pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. We shouldn't spend money on social services or helping the poor because if they just work hard enough, they will rise above, and it basically ignores all historical or material context. It's the idea that it doesn't matter. Don't think about it. We can all be rich. All you have to do is think harder and work harder.
Of the world's 85 richest people is equal to the 3.5 billion poorest people.
It's fantastic. And this is a great thing because it inspires everybody, gets the motivation to look up to the 1% and say, I want to become one of those people. I'm going to fight hard to get up to the top. This is fantastic news, and of course I applaud it. What can be wrong with this?
Really?
Yes, really.
So somebody living on
I celebrate capitalism.
$1 a day in Africa is getting up in the morning and saying, I'm going to be Bill Gates.
That's the motivation everybody needs.
Only thing between me and
I'm
that
not
guy
against
is
charity.
motivation. I just need to pull up my socks.
I am not
wait, I don't have socks.
So in the context of neoliberalism, it was really used to help justify defunding social services, lowering taxes, and deregulating the government, because if we all believe we can make it, then the poor don't need healthcare or food stamps. They just need to work harder. But what hyperindividualism also did was shift how the individual views themselves and where they fit in society. It was a shift from a more community-based, care for your neighbor, sacrifice for the greater good mindset to a I'm what matters, my needs are the top priority, and everything else comes second mindset. This affected our culture even more because the more individualistic people become, the harder it is to get them to conform and take part in that monoculture we explained earlier, because now conformity is the greatest sin and being different is the biggest virtue. This specific point helps to also explain why our trends are becoming further fractured and harder to view as a single, cohesive, defining aesthetic compared to the decade trends of the past. Back then, people wanted to fit in. They saw what those around them were wearing and wanted to be more like them. It's not that that doesn't really happen today, it's just that the mainstream thought is more to go against it. Don't be a follower, be unique, fuck fitting in. These are all the result of hyperindividualism and how it further fractures culture and trends. Now, the second relevant aspect of neoliberalism was the shareholder-driven profit model. In simple terms, this profit model emphasizes increasing stock value at all costs. It doesn't matter if your workers get paid less. It doesn't matter if you have to cut costs on services you actually need. It doesn't matter if the quality of your product goes down. It is all about making that stock value go up with as little work as possible. It's a follow the path of least resistance mindset and is a way to create wealth with as little risk as possible instead of maybe innovating or creating new and better products. It's Apple removing the headphone jack and forcing us all to buy AirPods, only to then sell us an adapter to have headphones again. It's Hollywood constantly remaking past movies because it's easier to recreate something that was successful than take a creative risk and make something unique. It's music labels noticing past successful sounds and aesthetics and forcing their artists to recreate them because nostalgia is always in and it's less work than taking a risk and creating something new. Remember how I said previously that postmodernism collapsed meaning and left us with nothing but nihilism and skepticism? Well, this is actually when neoliberal consumerism swooped in. I lied when I said modernism killed the glory of God and postmodernism killed the glory of man, leaving us with nothing, because in the postmodern era, we now have the glory of material. We live to consume and buy and buy and buy. With each new purchase and with that hit of dopamine, we are briefly distracted from our lack of culture or meaning, and our belief in ourselves is all we have left, so we might as well look good. We might as well have nice things. If this is all for nothing, we might as well make this life at least interesting by constantly consuming whatever trinket, clothes, or things are the next new gotta have purchase. Okay, so let's take a step back because honestly, we touched on a lot and I want to cohesively tie it all together so it can make a bit more sense. The reason it seems like we don't have the decade-defining trends of the past and why culture today is based so much on what came before is because 1, we are in the postmodern era. An era defined by individualism, subjectivity, skepticism, and information overload. This makes our society far more fragmented, and the media we consume gives us a constant reservoir of culture to draw from, which will naturally have people referencing what came before with such easy access to the past. In the modern era, we were far more conformist relative to today. Media reproduction was limited relative to today, and culture developed by rejecting what came before, making it far more distinct. And on this point, we get to 2. The 20th century saw a unique, rapid development of culture and social progression. You can only progress by rebelling against what came before for so long until there's nothing left to try. Eventually, anything and everything is allowed, which can make culture appear to stagnate. And lastly, 3, neoliberal capitalism further promoted individualism and personal uniqueness, but also favored shareholder-driven profit models, which incentivize recreating the past because it's easier than being creative. While social media affected the development of throwback culture from a more bottom-up, decentralized way, think of vintage Tumblr mood boards, niche YouTube indie artists, corporations and the neoliberal order did it in a top-down way. So now all the songs on the radio, mainstream artists, and movies are being heavily based on the past, which makes people even more influenced to find inspiration from that past. Now, something you may have noticed is that during this entire video, I kept saying that decades today do not appear to have as many unique or defining trends that separate them from the past. The reason I say appear is because we have to remember that nobody really knows what is trending or defining a time until after that period is over. For all we know, 50 years down the line, we might look back and think about how naive we all were and that we just couldn't see the trends because we were in the middle of them. But I do still think it's obvious that the trends that have been defining recent decades are not new at all and are based on heavily referencing the past. And this is why I said earlier that I see us in this unique moment where culture has kind of collapsed into this black hole. the era of everything, everywhere, all at once. But this is where I want to take the time to really challenge all these common critiques of the modern world. Yes, it can feel overwhelmingly annoying that everything popular today is just a remake of something previous, but in the postmodern, highly individualistic world we occupy now, you don't have to take part in it. No one is forcing you to reference the past or even like it. For literally the first time in human history, you have the choice to choose your own path detached from the oppressive restrictions of culture, social norms, or religion. Or if you want, you can choose to take part in those cultures, norms, or religions. It is completely up to you, and you don't have to conform out of the fear of social acceptance like you did in the past. I mean, from this point of view, is that such a bad thing? The way we currently view culture itself as something always progressing, degradable, and disposable isn't really natural. In some ways, we aren't even really describing culture at all. We are describing consumerism and capitalism. Capitalism is an ideology that is built on dissatisfaction. It is built on simply creating a problem, or more accurately, convincing you you have a problem and then selling you the solution. It is built on the complete obliteration of contentment, because when you are content, you don't need anything. You need to be in a constant state of dissatisfaction and yearning for capitalism to work. It's why so many say capitalism and sustainability are incompatible, or why so many religions negate it. Because anything that forces stability, fulfillment, or simply just takes a look at what you already have and says, you know what, I don't need anything else, I'm happy with what I have, collapses the business model. I think what we are sometimes doing when looking at the 20th century and wondering why we don't have the same novelty is thinking in this perpetually dissatisfied way. Before modern capitalism, cultures evolved, but they were over far greater time spans. Over the course of a single person's life, everything seemed quite stable. There wasn't this obsession with novelty like we have today, and traditions had meaning and value beyond consumption or price tag. This is all to say, is it really such a bad thing that we are now appreciating the value of what came before? Maybe what social media has done is just show us the incredible amount of culture, styles, music, fashion, and everything else the Industrial Revolution has given us, but that we previously never really had a way to appreciate in its entirety. The internet gives us such unlimited access to any time period that we are now able to choose between creative novelty and appreciation. From this point of view, I almost see where we are now as something like the era of satisfaction. The 20th century was like watching a kid grow up and go through all the phases of youth until they reached adulthood. The restrictions and innocence of childhood, the rebellion and experimentation of adolescence, the uncertainty and angst of early adulthood. Each stage was defined by an anxious longing for the next stage. I don't want to be a little kid anymore. I just want to be a cool teenager. I hate being a teenager. I just want to be an adult and finally have freedom. Then, without warning, adulthood finally came, and you suddenly found yourself looking back at each stage with a newfound appreciation for what you experienced and went through. You find yourself sinking into nostalgia and finally stop anxiously wishing for the future. And this way, it's like we are the adult stage of culture, mindfully looking back at the development of our lives with a new appreciation for each stage, style, or trend. It's the age of zero restriction, complete freedom, and appreciation for what got you to where you are. There's a reason we're all naturally so nostalgic. We don't realize the good times until the good times are over. So again, I'm not saying I think many of the critiques against modern culture aren't valid. I just think, as with most things, it's not all bad. Trust me, I genuinely think it's annoying that Gen Z and Alpha are cosplaying my childhood right now, but I also kind of like that I have the option to join or do whatever abstract, weird, creative thing I want. I think if people were more mindful and viewed the world in a more nuanced way, they would be able to live a much more happy, fulfilling life. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments, and I hope you all enjoyed this video.